This is E.W. Claville, and you're listening to the Claville Report. Today we're going to talk about 2022 midterm election recap. This has been a very, very intriguing and unpredictable midterm election. And what we have now in 2023, we have a changing of the guard as it relates to control of the House of Congress and keeping maybe a more solid hold on the Senate. And of course, the White House remaining the same. When we take a look at the midterm election of 2022 and what took place and what we're seeing now in 2023, it was predicted that it was going to be what's called a red wave. That means the conservatives, the Republicans, that were going to take over and just a wave or a tidal wave of new persons coming into these seats in Congress were going to change the world, change the culture of what we were seeing in the country. But the posters were a little off. Instead of a red wave, instead of a tidal wave, we actually saw a ripple. As a matter of fact, in looking at the numbers, it looks as if we only had 222 total Republicans now in the House, as opposed and 213 for Democrats. Now, of course, we do know historically, seats do change as it relates to who's in power at the time in the White House. Case in point, when you have a Democrat that's in the White House, more than likely in the midterm election, you will have the Republican Party or the other party take over in the House itself. The Senate itself tends to be more stoic, tends to be more consistent. So when you have a simple majority in the Senate, it tends to see more of a flip. But when you have a solid contingency in the Senate, you'll see that particular house, that particular chamber, remain constant. Currently in the Senate, we have 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans. Now we're going to get to the Senate in just a moment and talk about what took place in order to solidify that power that the Democrats have in the Senate, especially with the race in Georgia, which was historical by any measure. And for political pundits, political commentators like myself, political scientists, it was truly an election cycle that will be taught about, will be talked about, and will be used as an example of future elections to come. But let's go back to the House. Let's go back to the House. Now, those of you that may have forgotten, prior to President Joe Biden becoming president, we had 4 years of President Donald Trump. Now, former president, his footprint and influence is still reigning in the Republican Party, as we see. However, it is waning. It's getting a little bit lower. It's not as impactful as it used to be when he was in the White House, but it's still there. What do I mean by that? So, President Donald Trump at the time basically took over the identity of the Republican Party. We know that every day there was something coming out from the White House. Every day there was a tweet. Every day there was a story. Every day there was some type of controversy that was taking place, or that was at afoot, in the particular, in the White House. With that being the case, we also find where we see that the country itself was going through changes, a cultural change. Because prior to that, we had 8 years of President Barack Obama. And that was a cultural shift, a major cultural shift of what we had been accustomed to in our country. Before President Barack Obama, we had a total of 0 presidents that were not white and not male. With President Barack Obama's election, it changed. It made America start to rethink its stance, start to rethink its idea of what an American is. And from there, we ended up seeing a lot of persons that were encouraged, that were inspired to take public office. A lot of individuals who are in office today, new congresspersons, they say that they were inspired by President Barack Obama becoming president. Others that are in the White House, others that are in state houses, local boards, school boards, city councils. These individuals said that they were inspired. So you have a generation that did not know what we know today. But now you have a generation that says, hey, because he did it, we can do it. Well, that's one side of the coin. But now you have another side of the coin. And that side of the coin is that group of individuals that was not so encouraged, that was not so inspired. As a matter of fact, those individuals that say, hey, this is not the country that we want. We want to keep things as is. But can things stay as is, right? So when we start to look at what took place, the next 4 years, President Donald Trump, you start to see that those voices on the fringe, started to creep into the mainstream and found a prominent place in the highest office in the land. Those individuals now started to become elected to Congress. You see various congresspersons that espouse what we call conspiracy theories. Now, these are theories that ideas or that people believe are taking place or that are afoot, but there's no evidence to suggest any of that. Case in point, the election. That the election was fraudulent, the election was stolen. Now we see that there are many individuals now that are regretting that decision, that are regretting believing that or espousing that, and then some even acting on it. So when you take, and then not only that, but I'll be remiss if I don't talk about COVID. One thing about our country that I love, many things I love about it, but one thing that I truly, truly admire and love is that our innovation. We were able to, in the midst of a once in 100-year pandemic, come up with a vaccine in order to immunize the entire world against a disease that we knew not, a disease that this world has never seen, in the matter of about 18 months. I want you to think about that for a moment. In 18 months, we were able to, through technology, through science, we were able to find a vaccine, find help for people. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is that now we see conspiracy theory. Again, saying, no, this is going to take over your life. This is going to, they're putting microchips in you. It's going to change your DNA and so forth and so on. So people are refusing to take the vaccine. And people are dying left and right. Many of us, including myself, have had individuals connected to our families or in our immediate family or extended families that actually died because of COVID. But again, conspiracy theories creeping to the top. And now in 2022, during the midterm elections, we have individuals that are still in office that espouse those conspiracy theories and are continuing to push and dictate policy. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the Republican Party, which is the majority, and how the majority leader was elected. And then let's take a look at the minority party, which are the Democrats, and the new leader of that particular party. So when we take a look at the majority, Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House. Now that's easier said than how it actually took place. In the first time in the history of our country, we had a speaker that went through more votes in order to be elected speaker than any other speaker in the history of our country. Now, there was a time period of our country during the time of the Civil War where it actually took longer for a speaker to be elected. However, as it relates to the vote, and we understand that the country was divided based upon the ideology and the actual war, the Civil War itself. However, when we take a look at it, comparing that day and this time, I don't think the ideology is different. Now, we're not at war. We're not at a physical war, but we are at a cultural war. We're in an ideological war. And I will talk more about that as we continue this particular series. But when we take a look at what we are experiencing in the country, there's no better example of the divide, the sheer divide, than we have, and we see what took place in the Republican Party to elect the Speaker of the House. So, what took place? You had what's called the Freedom Caucus. Freedom Caucus is about 20 individuals, individual congresspersons, who basically are really used to be the Tea Party. Now they're called the Freedom Caucus. And these individuals, this particular party, came in, this party subset, other political party, came into be during the time of John Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House. Now they've marched into what we have today. These individuals held up and held hostage the election of the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. How did they do that? The Speaker of the House needed so many votes in order to be elected. However, he could not get those votes if his party was holding out, or for the most part, he didn't have that majority to be elected. Now, the Democrats, to their credit, they voted lockstep. Hakeem Jeffries continued to have all of the Democratic votes that their party had in order to be elected Speaker. Now, of course, he wasn't going to be elected Speaker because they didn't have the majority, but we saw in lockstep what the Democratic Party was doing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment as we look at Hakeem Jeffries in the future of the Democratic Party itself. So let's go back to what took place with the Republicans. When we take a look at the votes, fell on the first vote, fell on the second vote, ninth vote, 10th vote, and so forth and so on. This is Kevin McCarthy's own party had to negotiate with the Freedom Caucus. Now, this is all part of politics. And I remember doing a commentary for our local news station about this and talking about, what are we looking at? Is this going to tear the country up? Already in a state of flux. And in the words of one of the great quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers, I said, relax. Everything's going to be okay, but it's going to have to work its way through. And one great thing about it is that our Constitution holds up, and the rules that are allowed to be created in the House by the Constitution, these individuals are able to, now we're able to see politics and our Constitution and our democracy at work. When we take a look at our democracy at work, we saw potential crisis, but it was really a non-crisis. But it was also a glimpse into what we see, what the future is. What do I mean by that? Seeing what the future is. In order for Kevin McCarthy to be elected Speaker of the House, and tempers flared. As a matter of fact, one congressperson had to be pulled off or held back against another congressperson from the Freedom Caucus because of how many times and the frustration that started to bubble to the top for this particular group in this particular vote. But they had to negotiate with the Freedom Caucus in order to get their commitment for him to be Speaker. Some of these concessions that were received in order to get the vote were very cushy, very unique, and very high-level positions for high-level committees. Now, why is this very important? This is very important because usually, unless you're at a senior level or you bring some type of major benefit to the party, such as a movement, voters, and so forth, fundraising, which I think now fundraising is almost null and void because of Citizens United, U.S. Supreme Court case 2009, where an individual can now just do whatever. You can get a PAC and raise as much money as you want. But nevertheless, when we take a look at what actually happened, these individuals in the Freedom Caucus now are on very high-profile committees, and some are even chairing those committees or subcommittees. Why is this important? Because now these individuals are helping to dictate the trajectory and the agenda of the Republican Party moving forward in the next 6 months. What can we expect in the next 6 months? Give me one moment, and we'll peer into the crystal ball to find out. But Kevin McCarthy is the new Speaker of the House. Kevin McCarthy was a Trump loyalist. Kevin McCarthy hails out of the state of California, which, ironically, the last Speaker of the House hailed out of the state of California. So is California, is this the state that dictates power, dictates policy, dictates politics across the country? Well, for the last two cycles, last two speakers, we do see that being the case. However, the group behind him, and keep in mind, Kevin McCarthy is a seasoned politician. He understands Washington. He understands how it works. He understands how to get deals made. He understands how to get things through the process. He understands how the country, the voters, how they look at politicians in Washington. This is key for any politician. Know your constituency, know the demographics, know exactly what you need in order to move forward with your agenda and to get it accomplished. On the other side in the Senate, Mitch McConnell himself understands that. And we see, if you go back and take a look at some of the former Claville reports, you'll see where I talked about Mitch McConnell. I called him Justice McConnell. How he ushered in and was able to use an architect of what we see now on the Supreme Court. Like him or love him, hate him, whatever the case. Don't like him. He was masterful in how he constructed the Supreme Court as we see it today, as we will see it in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. This is what we see our U.S. Supreme Court to be because of an individual that understood politics, understood the agenda, understood long term, and understood what our country is looking at. Very similar to Kevin McCarthy. So let's take a look at the other side of the aisle, the Democrats. Now, the Democrats, of course, they led the House of Representatives under former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, for quite a while. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker, of course, the first woman Speaker of the House, again, hailing from California, a political veteran, someone that understands and understood, still does, politics, understands people, understands how power works, understands and really help a lot of people up, put a lot of people in place to where they are now really making strides in their career positions. Now we have what's called the changing of the guard. The changing of the guard as it relates to identity, as it relates to ideology, as it relates to even geography. Hakeem Jeffries is the first, he is an African-American male out of New York who is now the minority leader of the House, which means that he is the leader of the Democratic Party. Congressman Jeffries made a very important statement when he handed over the gavel to Kevin McCarthy. The statement that he made was that we're at a crossroads in our country, a crossroads that we have to determine where we want to go, what we want to do. That was a very important statement that he made because he understood the culture war. He understood what was taking place in our country over the course of, as I articulated in the very beginning, the last 12 years. 12 years, our country has been shifting, going back and forth. What I call that pendulum of change. And some of you, if you go back and listen to former Claville reports, I talk about that pendulum of change. And I'll continue to use that theory of the pendulum of change, of society, of legal cases, of justice, of politics, of economics, the pendulum of change as we see it today. He understands that it's swinging and it's leaning toward a more of a acceptance ideology in society as it relates to some things that were taboo. He also sees it as more of a interactive group or of advocacy on the ground through technology and of voters and constituents that we haven't seen since the likes of the Vietnam War during the time of protests in our country and also the civil rights movement. He understands that there is a changing in the country where society says no more do we want what they said America was or what America only could have been. No more do we want that. But we see a new America. We see a bolder America. We see a more prosperous America. Now, of course, you will have debate back and forth on what that America is and what is the interpretation of, is this new good or what is the meaning of prosperity? So you'll see a lot of discussion between that. Of course, you'll see older persons and more seasoned say that this generation doesn't know hard work and things of that nature, but society changes. And with society, as it changes, you have to change with it. Technology. I remember being a young summer associate at a law firm, and one of the partners talked about how the changing of business, the changing of the law, the business of law, how everyone operated at the same level. You would send something in the mail, and you'll wait to get something back by mail. And you send something through FedEx or parcel service, and you wait to get something back through FedEx or parcel service. You'll send a fax, and then you wait to get something back by fax. You send an email, you wait to get something back by email. And now we have BlackBerries, which means that once a client sends you something by email, it now becomes your problem, and you have to respond to it immediately. And now we have virtual. Now you could submit a case and testify all through virtual and upload documents and so forth in the court system. Society changes. You have to change along with it if you want to keep up and remain competitive. So you'll see that debate going back and forth. But Hakeem Jeffries, Congressman Jeffries, understands that. He understands the culture war. He understands what America is engulfed in right now. This is not something that's coming. We're here. I talked about earlier the conspiracy theories that were bubbling to the top. They were at the fringes. It became mainstream. Then they found a prominent place in the highest office of the land. Now they found a prominent place at the head of major committees within the House, which now gets me to what will we see in the next 6 months? Now that the Republicans are at the helm of the majority in the House, I believe that we will start to see a lot more investigations. Right now, you're probably looking at and understand that there's a lot of reports of our current president and former vice president and other individuals that have classified documents that are at their home, at their private residence. Now, some may say that this is a very bad thing. Others may say, well, what is the substance of those documents? Others may say our former president, President Trump, had a trove of documents. Even some may say a mini library in a closet in his home, compared to a few documents by his former vice president and our current president when he was vice president. Nevertheless, this is the narrative that's bubbling to the top. This is part of what's taking place as relates to investigations. And also, as we look at the president, current president being in the spotlight, we also see where his son, the investigation of a laptop that he had bubbling to the top, also taking place. So when we ask ourselves, what are these things? When we ask ourselves, what are these issues that are taking place? When we ask ourselves, what are these investigations? That's what we're looking at. Now, some may say this is totally unfair. Others may say, well, during the time of former President Trump's term, I believe he was impeached several times or brought up for impeachment several times. Of course, these investigations kind of died because they couldn't get any traction. And they, of course, they were brought up, but nothing really happened. So did we waste our time in government? As a matter of fact, the current minority speaker, the current minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, is one of the presenters in one of the trials that took place. Then, of course, we see the January 6th investigation committee, that report. So during the time of President Trump's tenure, we saw committee after committee, investigation after investigation, and really, if we look at what transpired out of that, he remained in office. No one was indicted. No one went to jail. Now, of course, this will continue as we can take a look at what may happen through the Department of Justice in January 6th, but that's, we'll see. That's all to be determined. However, what we do see is that now, just as Republicans, when they were in office, and with the Benghazi investigation of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and now, of course, with President Biden, we'll see that ramp up again. We'll see those investigations. Does this help the country? Does it split the country? Who knows? It's really all about the moment. And politics is very fleeting, the memory of politics. We forget these things took place. I'm pretty sure you forgot about Benghazi. I'm pretty sure you forgot about the first trial impeachment. I'm pretty sure you forgot about the second. And pretty soon, I'm pretty sure a lot of people will forget about January 6th. It's just the nature of what takes place in our country. It's all about the now. Now, when we take a look at what will take place in the House, very similarly in the Senate. I think you'll start to see a Senate that is more settled. Now, of course, when we take a look at the Senate, you have a more solid, base of voters, of Democrats there than you have, but again, a slim majority. The Georgia election between now Senator Warnock and his challenger at the time, Herschel Walker, was historical because you had two African-American males that were running for Senate in the state of Georgia. That is historical, representing the two major parties. We've never seen that, but we're going to start to see more and more of that. And what we also understand is this Senate will continue to be the backstop against any issues that come from the House that may not align with the Democratic agenda in the White House. So, as we see, it's never boring in Washington. As we see, change continues to come. But change is very short because the great thing about our democracy is that we elect our new congresspersons every 2 years. And we have an opportunity to dictate what we want to see in our country. You have a chance to help to forge the future out of the ideas, out of the hearts of the men and women here in our country, so that we can form a better union, a more unified union. But I'm excited to see what happens. Of course, stay tuned, and we'll talk about more as we move ahead in 2023 and the political agenda for Washington. You've been listening to the Claville Report. I'm E.W. Claville. We'll see you in the next segment. God bless.